I remember the day I moved in with Michael and his parents. It was a sunny morning in June, the kind that held promises of new beginnings. Michael and I had been dating for a year, and everything about our relationship felt right. We were young, in love, and ready to start a new chapter together. The move was significant for me. Leaving my small hometown and moving 5 hours away to live with Michael was a leap of faith. My parents were supportive but cautious, reminding me to always keep my independence in mind. Michael had asked for their blessing, which they gave after many heart-to-heart conversations. His parents' house was a cozy 2-story building with a welcoming porch and a well-tended garden. The first time I visited, I was struck by its warmth. Michael's parents, Linda and Robert, greeted me with open arms. Linda was a petite woman with a smile that lit up the room, and Robert was a tall, jovial man who could make anyone laugh within minutes of meeting him. I felt a connection with them instantly. During those early visits, Linda and I would spend hours chatting in the kitchen, baking cookies, or preparing dinner. She had a way of making everything seem effortless, and I admired her for that. Robert was equally engaging, always ready with a story or a joke, making sure everyone around him was having a good time. Moving in felt like the natural next step. Michael and I talked about it for months, and when the day finally came, it was exciting. My stuff fit into the room Michael and I shared, and his parents made sure I felt welcome. Linda hugged me tightly, saying, "Welcome to the family, dear." The first few weeks were like living in a dream. I was getting along great with Michael's parents. We had family dinners every night, where we shared stories and laughed over Robert's jokes. Linda would sometimes whisper advice about handling Michael's quirks, and I found her insights invaluable. I noticed how they all worked as a unit, and I did my best to fit into their rhythm. I helped with chores, trying not to step on anyone's toes. Michael seemed happy, and seeing him in his element, surrounded by his family, made me love him even more. However, as weeks turned into months, the initial excitement started to wane. I began noticing little things, subtle shifts in behavior that I hadn't picked up on before. It was nothing major at first, just a sense of something being slightly off. I couldn't put my finger on it, but I felt a change in the air, a tension that hadn't been there before. I shrugged it off initially, attributing it to the adjustment phase of living together. But as more time passed, these small changes began to form a pattern, one that I couldn't ignore for long. It was the beginning of what would become a challenging journey, one that would test my strength, my relationship, and my understanding of what it means to be part of a family. As autumn set in, the warmth of the summer months seemed to fade, not just outside, but within the walls of the house as well. The subtle changes I had noticed earlier were becoming more pronounced, more frequent. It was as if a different side of Linda and Robert was slowly revealing itself, one I hadn't seen before. One evening, I was in the kitchen, washing dishes after dinner. It was something I had done many times before, but this time something was different. I had stepped away for a moment, leaving a couple of my dishes in the sink. When I returned, I found that Linda had washed everything else but had left my dishes untouched, set aside as if they were somehow separate, unclean. At first, I thought it might have been an oversight, but it happened again, and then again. It wasn't just the dishes. It was little things, like Linda moving my belongings to a corner of the room, or Robert making offhand comments about my job or my habits. It was never anything overtly hostile, but it stung all the same. I tried to talk to Michael about it to see if he had noticed anything. His response was always the same, a shrug and a quick, "That's just how they are, they don't mean anything by it." But I wasn't convinced. It felt personal, intentional. One incident in particular left a deep mark. It was a simple, casual cruelty, the kind that slices through you because it comes when your guard is down. I was serving Michael his dinner when Linda, with a pointed look, asked, "You're eating again?" Her tone was light, almost joking, but the implication was clear. I felt my face flush with embarrassment and shame. I had always been self-conscious about my weight, a fact that Linda knew. Her comment hit me hard, and from that day on I started skipping meals, eating only when I was sure I was alone. The joy I once found in cooking and sharing meals with the family vanished, replaced by anxiety and a deepening sense of isolation. Michael didn't notice, or if he did, he never said anything. It felt as though I was becoming invisible in my own home, my presence tolerated rather than welcomed. The relationship I had thought so fondly of with Linda and Robert was crumbling, and I couldn't understand why. I started spending more time in our room, away from the family. The house, once a symbol of a new chapter in my life with Michael, now felt like a trap, confining and cold. I felt alone, misunderstood, and increasingly unwanted. I clung to the belief that this was just a phase, that things would get better with time. But deep down, I knew that something fundamental had shifted. I was no longer just Michael's girlfriend. I was an outsider, living under the same roof but feeling miles apart. The growing tension in the house was like a silent storm, brewing beneath the surface, waiting to break. And as the days turned into weeks, and the weeks into months, that storm would soon find its voice in ways I could never have anticipated. Winter arrived with its short days and long, cold nights, mirroring the growing chill inside the house. The unease I felt around Linda was now compounded by a new, more unsettling problem: Robert's behavior. Robert, once the jovial storyteller, began showing a side of himself that was far less amiable, especially after he'd had a few drinks. His humor, which I once found endearing, turned biting and cruel. He'd make offhand remarks about people's appearances, often focusing on their weight, and laugh it off as though it were all in good fun. But the laughter never reached his eyes. One evening, his comments became personal. He made a joke about my weight in front of Michael and his friends. I excused myself quickly, holding back tears until I was safely in the bathroom. Michael came to check on me later, brushing off his father's words as just Dad being Dad. But it was more than that. It was humiliation, served coldly and publicly. The incident that truly shook me happened when Michael was out of town for work. I was taking a shower, lost in thought, when I heard the bathroom door handle jiggle. I had locked the door, a habit I had formed since moving in. Through the frosted glass, I saw Robert's silhouette. He knocked, his voice slurred, asking if I needed help. I replied sharply that I was fine, but my heart was racing. The thought of what might have happened if I hadn't locked the door sent shivers down my spine. I confronted Michael about it when he returned, but he seemed unable to grasp the severity of the situation. He assured me it was a misunderstanding, that his dad probably just didn't realize I was in the shower. But I couldn't shake the feeling of vulnerability, the sense that I wasn't safe in my own home. Amidst all this, I continued to help Linda and Robert with their needs. I assisted Linda with her medical paperwork, drove her to appointments 2 hours away, and even missed classes to be there for her. For Robert, I helped with their immigration papers, communicating with lawyers and organizing documents. I poured myself into these tasks, hoping to bridge the growing gap between us. But my efforts seemed to go unnoticed, or worse, unappreciated. The more I did, the more I felt like I was being used, a means to an end rather than a valued member of the family. It was a stark contrast to the early days of baking cookies and sharing laughs. Now every smile felt forced, every conversation strained. I confided in Michael about how I felt, but his reactions only added to my distress. He accused me of being ungrateful, of not understanding the sacrifices his parents had made for him. He called me a spoiled brat for complaining about people who had done so much for him. I felt increasingly isolated, not just from his parents, but from Michael as well. The man I moved 5 hours to be with, the man I loved, seemed to be on a completely different page. I began to question everything about our relationship, about the decision to move in with his family, about who I was in this dynamic. I was stuck in a home that no longer felt like home, with people who saw me as an outsider and a partner who didn't seem to see me at all. The feeling of going crazy, of not being able to trust my own feelings, was overwhelming. I was lost, struggling to find my footing in a place where I once thought I'd stand firm. The tension in the house had reached a palpable level, like a thick fog that refused to lift. I knew I couldn't continue living this way, walking on eggshells, feeling unwelcome in my own home. It was time for a direct conversation with Michael, one where I laid out everything that had been weighing on me. I chose a quiet evening, when Michael and I were alone in our room, to broach the subject. My heart pounded as I started to speak, my words laced with a mix of frustration and desperation. I told him about the growing distance with his parents, the hurtful comments, the incidents that made me feel unsafe, and how his reactions only added to my feelings of isolation. Michael listened, but his expression grew increasingly defensive. When I finished, he let out a long sigh and shook his head. "Anna, you're overthinking things. My parents are good people. They've been through a lot. You just need to try harder to understand them." His words felt like a slap. Try harder? I had been bending over backward to fit into his family, to be helpful, understanding, and patient. But it was never enough. And now, instead of support, I was met with accusations of overreacting. The argument that followed was heated and painful. Michael accused me of being ungrateful, of not appreciating the roof over my head and the efforts his parents had made to welcome me. He said I was acting like a spoiled brat, creating problems where there were none. I tried to explain how his words hurt me, how they made me feel alone and unsupported. But the more I spoke, the more he seemed to withdraw, his words turning colder, more dismissive. That night, I lay awake, staring at the ceiling, feeling a chasm growing between Michael and me. The man I loved, the man I had moved cities for, was telling me that my feelings, my experiences, were invalid. I felt like I was losing my grip on reality, questioning my own perceptions and judgments. The following days were a blur of tension and awkward silences. Michael and I were like strangers, passing each other in the house without a word. His parents seemed oblivious to the storm brewing, or perhaps they chose to ignore it. I began to wonder if I was indeed the problem. Was I being too sensitive? Was I expecting too much? These questions haunted me, eroding my confidence and sense of self. I felt trapped, not just in the house, but in my own mind, doubting everything I thought I knew. But amidst the turmoil, a small voice inside me whispered that this wasn't right. I couldn't be the only one at fault here. The treatment I received, the lack of support from Michael, the feeling of being an outsider in my own home, these were not figments of my imagination. The more I reflected, the clearer it became. I needed to find a way out of this cycle of doubt and unhappiness. I needed to reclaim my sense of self, to find my voice again. But the path to doing so was murky and fraught with uncertainty. I was standing at a crossroads with each direction leading into the unknown. As winter gave way to the early signs of spring, the internal storm I was weathering showed no signs of subsiding. The house felt colder than ever, a stark contrast to the blooming world outside. Inside, I was battling a turmoil that seemed to grow with each passing day. I spent long hours in our room, alone with my thoughts, reflecting on everything that had happened. My relationship with Michael, once the source of so much joy and hope, now felt like a maze of confusion and pain. I loved him, but that love was entangled in a web of resentment, misunderstanding, and deep emotional disconnect. The more I thought about it, the more I realized how much I had changed since moving in with Michael and his parents. I had always prided myself on being strong, independent, and confident, but now I found myself questioning my every move, doubting my every thought. The vibrant, self-assured woman I once was seemed like a distant memory. I also reflected on the sacrifices I had made. Moving 5 hours away from my family had been a significant step, one I had taken out of love and trust. But now I felt isolated, not just from my family but from the person I used to be. My world had shrunk to the confines of this house, and with it my sense of self. My conversations with Michael had become sparse and functional. The warmth we once shared replaced by a cautious politeness. It was as if we were both treading on thin ice, afraid that any wrong step could shatter the fragile surface under our feet. In moments of solitude, I found myself yearning for the comfort of my family. I missed the easy laughter, the unconditional support, the feeling of being understood and accepted for who I was. I missed being able to share my thoughts without fear of judgment or dismissal. The realization hit me hard. I was losing myself in this relationship, in this house. The Anna that moved in months ago was not the Anna I saw in the mirror now. I had become a shadow, a version of myself that was unfamiliar and unsettling. The question of what to do next weighed heavily on my mind. Leaving seemed like the obvious solution, but it wasn't that simple. There were financial considerations, the fear of being alone, and the daunting prospect of starting over. But staying meant continuing to live in an environment that was slowly eroding my sense of self-worth and happiness. I sought counsel from friends and even considered therapy. Each conversation brought new perspectives, but the decision ultimately was mine to make. It was clear that something had to change. I couldn't continue living in a state of perpetual unhappiness and self-doubt. As spring turned into summer, the decision crystallized in my mind. I needed to find my independence again, to reclaim the life I had before, a life where I felt strong, valued, and happy. The journey ahead would be challenging, but the first step, as always, is the hardest. As the summer sun brought warmth and light, I knew it was time to make some decisions. The resolve to change my situation had been growing, and now it was time to act. I started by seeking advice and support outside the walls of the house that had become my prison. Talking to friends was a balm for my weary soul. They listened, offered empathy, and reminded me of the person I used to be. Their words were like a mirror, reflecting a version of myself I had almost forgotten. It was during these conversations that I realized the importance of having a support system, people who saw me for who I truly was. I also sought professional help. The therapist I met with provided a safe space to unravel my thoughts and feelings. It was through these sessions that I began to understand the depth of the impact my living situation had on me. I was not crazy or overly sensitive. I was reacting to a genuinely challenging environment. Armed with this newfound clarity, I started exploring my options. I began saving money, cutting down on unnecessary expenses, and looking for affordable places I could move into. The idea of living on my own was daunting, but it also filled me with a sense of excitement and freedom. It was a tangible goal, a light at the end of a long, dark tunnel. The most challenging part was confronting Michael about our relationship. I chose a quiet evening when we were both calm and rested to have the conversation. I explained my feelings, my need for independence, and how our current living situation was affecting me. I told him that I was considering moving out, not to end our relationship, but to save it. Michael's reaction was mixed. He seemed to understand on some level why I felt the way I did. But there was also a sense of hurt, a feeling of being abandoned. We talked for hours, navigating our way through a maze of emotions and fears. It was the most honest conversation we'd had in months. Despite the pain and the uncertainty, there was a sense of relief in having everything out in the open. We agreed to give each other some space to think about what we both wanted from the relationship and our lives. The weeks that followed were a time of introspection and planning. I continued to save money, research apartments, and mentally prepare myself for the possibility of a new beginning. The decision to move out was not an easy one, but it felt right. It was a step towards reclaiming my independence, my sense of self. Through it all, I held on to the hope that Michael and I could find a way to navigate this new phase of our relationship. But I also knew that no matter what happened between us, I needed to be true to myself, to live a life where I felt respected, valued, and happy. The decision to move out was like turning the page to a new chapter in my life. It was a step filled with uncertainty, but also with a sense of empowerment. I had finally taken control of my situation, making a choice that prioritized my well-being. As I started packing my things, I felt a mix of emotions. There was sadness in leaving a place I had once hoped would be a long-term home, and in the strain it had placed on my relationship with Michael. But there was also a growing sense of excitement and liberation. I was about to embark on a journey of self-discovery, to rebuild the life I wanted on my own terms. The day I moved out, Michael helped me with my bags. Our goodbye was bittersweet. We promised to keep in touch, to try and work on our relationship from a new perspective. But there was also an unspoken understanding that things might never be the same again. That was a reality we both had to accept. Moving into my new apartment, a small but cozy space, was a breath of fresh air. For the first time in months, I felt a sense of peace. The walls of my new home were blank canvases, waiting for me to fill them with my own story, my own identity. In the weeks that followed, I focused on myself. I reconnected with hobbies and interests I had neglected, spent more time with friends and family, and continued my therapy sessions. Each day was a step towards healing, towards rebuilding the confidence and self-assuredness I had lost. My relationship with Michael evolved in unexpected ways. With the distance between us, we began to see each other and our relationship more clearly. We had deep, meaningful conversations about our needs and expectations. Sometimes they were difficult and emotional, but they were always honest. In this newfound space, I rediscovered parts of myself that I had lost. I rekindled my love for painting, a passion I had set aside in the chaos of the past months. I started a small freelance project, combining my artistic skills with a newfound sense of entrepreneurial spirit. It was a small step, but it filled me with a sense of purpose and joy. As summer turned to autumn, I looked back at the journey I had been on. It was a path marked by challenges, self-doubt, and pain, but also by growth, resilience, and self-discovery. I had learned the hard way that sometimes, to find your place in the world, you have to be willing to leave the comfort of what you know. My story with Michael was still being written. Whether we would find our way back to each other or forge separate paths, only time would tell. But one thing was clear: I was no longer the person who had moved into his parents' house all those months ago. I was stronger, wiser, and more in tune with who I was and what I wanted from life. And for the first time in a long time, I was genuinely excited about the future, about the possibilities that lay ahead. I had found my path forward, and I was ready to see where it would lead.